Go.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our 10th Devices and Drugs webinar, which is a bit scary. So anyway, we'll get started straight away, but if there's any questions, we'll do them at the end. So please just put them in the chat, and there'll be a recording of this available on the MedTechnique Consulting website as well as the Lucid website, and you'll be able to access it through LinkedIn. So it'll be available for you to use. So I might just leap straight in. And look, this is just a slide I include every time because we quite often get people from overseas. So this, Australia has a universal health care system, which means that we're all covered by the Australian version of Medicare. But about half of all Australians also have private health insurance. But in Australia, private health insurance is just limited to hospital cover and ancillary cover, which is like dental and physio and other stuff like that. But it generally excludes primary care and pharmaceuticals, which is covered by our Medicare system. So weirdly, we have a mix of public and private hospital systems which financially operate very, very differently. So the system can be, well, it's a good system overall, it can be somewhat fragmented, and there can be a lot of perverse economic incentives. Great. So what we'll be concentrating a bit on today is medical technologies in private hospitals. So under our Australian Medicare system, the medical benefits schedule is a list of medical procedures subsidised by Medicare. And to be covered by private health insurance, a procedure must be included on the MBS. And there's another quirk of the private insurance system in Australia in that implantable devices and some other devices, hips, pacemakers, basically anything you walk out of the hospital with the device inside you, get a payment over and above the payment the hospital will receive from the insurer. And that's called the prescribed list. And devices that are not implanted are at a disadvantage because they're not included on the prescribed list. So the hospital has to meet the cost of those devices out of what they get paid for the procedure. So let's have a look at 2024 in politics. So we've had this is not a new government now, but we have 3-year terms in Australia, and this is the last full year of the first term Labor government. And in terms of health policy, it's mainly been implementation of policies announced and started in 2023. So the one-stop shop clinical trial program is continuing, and there's been further implementation of the prescribed list reforms where they're really up and running. And like usual, that's what we'll be talking about most today because that's where all the action usually happens. And in addition to the 50-something Medicare urgent care clinics that were established last year, there's an additional 29 been approved and are being implemented this year. And another interesting thing in the radiography space is that previously only some MRIs that radiology practices had were funded by Medicare, but basically now all practices with an MRI have access to Medicare funding. So that's a big change in the access to MRI. So in terms of the political parties, you know, there's quite a reasonable to high chance of there being a minority government next year, which means that neither of the major parties has enough seats in the lower house to govern in their own right and has to make a government out of the crossbench. And it's more than likely to be a Labor government because they have less hurdles to overcome. But there's certainly a possibility that the coalition or the right-wing party in Australia will be able to form government. The Labor Party's health policies are well known and established, but the federal opposition really hasn't released any health policy that I could find, other than a general promise to provide incentives for young doctors to enter general practice. So, we'd anticipate that there will be a flurry of policy announcements towards the end of the year. And the election's likely to be held, I'd say somewhere between March and May. George. Okay, so as I said, all the change and issues continue to be from the prescribed list. So I'll go through the issues one by one. So on the prescribed list, there's a group of products called, so-called general use items, which have always been really problematic in that the insurers really, really hate paying for them. And they tend to be things like a lot of devices related to endoscopy or sutures or wound closure or a whole bunch of other things like that. And it was planned that all of these devices that had been identified as general use were to be removed from the prescribed list and other arrangements made. So by other arrangements, basically the hospitals and the insurers were required to negotiate to determine another funding mechanism. And surprise, surprise, that didn't turn out very well, because basically the insurers were wanting their outcome from this reform was to pay much, much less, as they felt they were paying too much for these items. And the hospitals, believed that and stated that these devices were entirely necessary and had to be funded appropriately, and they were completely unable to come to an agreement, which could probably have been predicted, but nevertheless. So in May this year, basically, this process was given up on, and the minister announced that the general use items would continue to be funded under the current prescribed list arrangements and included in a section called Part D, which was very good news for the industry, because it was, there was a lot of products that were really key to some pretty major procedures. For example, a lot of gastroenterology surgery and things like that would have really had difficulty in being funded. But there's a huge catch in that any new innovative products that will require a new clinical group. So, if there's a new type of device that does something different, that doesn't fit into the existing categories of Part D, they will not be considered. And, this seems to me quite unreasonable, because if you're going to fund them, you may as well fund them properly. But so far, there's been no backing down from this position. So at the moment, if you do have something innovative and it should be included on Part D, it's going to be far more challenging to get it listed. And the industry has pushed back on this, but so far without success, probably because, the department probably feels that there's been a huge concession made by leaving these devices funded. So the next thing I want to turn to is the evidence requirements. So there was a draft PL guide released in December 2023, which was very unhelpful for people who had an early January cut-off date for applications. And, the guide was in the main part quite general and not very specific in what was needed for an application. However, there were some really unanticipated and quite onerous and specific evidence requirements for a whole bunch of different craft groups. So that was cardiovascular, neurosurgical, ophthalmic, orthopedic, and some others. But there was, all of which, most of them were not too much of a surprise, but the ophthalmic devices, which generally, particularly the lenses, are class 2B and ordinarily would have been able to be assessed under an abbreviated process, a tier 1 application, because in many cases they're a commodity-like device, are not allowed to be assessed under that process and must go through the higher clinical assessment. And for lenses, there's a sorry about that. The lenses must have published evidence over 12 years of 100 lenses, not 12 years, I'm sorry, 12 months of 100 devices, which is quite out of step with what's usually done within the industry. So it's very, very difficult for new devices. Your best hope of getting it. We seem to have a rogue phone in here somehow. Your best hope of getting an ophthalmic new lens in is to try and compare it to an earlier version or a predicate device, and just try and have evidence on the change in the device. And there's very, very onerous evidence requirements for spinal cord stimulators, or neurosurgical implantable pulse generators, as they're called, because there's a requirement for every iteration of every new device that is published comparative clinical trials of at least 40 devices for 2 years. And this is really very difficult for companies to meet. There's been considerable industry lobbying to try and get these reversed, and lots of discussions and letters and meetings. However, so far, these requirements have not been modified. So it's really, when doing these applications, you just have to bear this in mind and try and be as strategic as you can. And my advice would be to concentrate on getting evidence for the change in the device. And then if it's a predicate device, try and utilise your evidence for that predicate device, and on top of that, use your evidence for whatever the change is, assuming you have that available. And there's a proviso in the draft that all evidence requirements will always be made in context of the specific device, which is not very clear. So the way I interpret that is there's a high degree of unpredictability in how these applications are assessed. So the other thing is, it's been a bit of a drag for the industry, is Part C. So Part C is a section of the prescribed list that is all about devices that aren't implanted. And for many, many, many years, the industry has lobbied that the implantable requirement is anachronistic, impractical, doesn't deal with the way innovation is taking place in medical technology. And there's always been a promise that, or anticipation, that this would change with the reform. However, it has not. And it's been really disappointing, because even while the industry asked for requirements for a Part C so that people knew what to do, there were no guidelines issued for Part C. And most, if not all, Part C applications have been deferred, basically due to not being exceptional enough. And I know, because I had several, and they all had the same feedback, that MedTech noticed that there was a lack of clarity on the methods of assessing the information provided, mainly that they hadn't decided how they were going to assess these applications. and that the expectations to the minimum level and quality of evidence required to be clarified, which was pretty much what everyone was asking for many years. And also they've said that a couple of other things they mentioned in these communications was that devices had to be demonstrated to be exceptional enough to be included on Part D, but C, sorry, but with no clarity as to what exceptional means. And they seem to introduce other requirements saying that criticising the application for not being interchangeable with a PL device, a device that was already listed. And this happened back in June, I believe, and there's been no public updates or consultation on what's happening. And at the moment, if you submit a Part C application, it may not even be assessed. So it's pretty poor. You know, I do think it's a pretty poor response. So just a few little other issues, the surgical guides and biomodel. I put a picture there in case you're not familiar with what these are. So these basically are biomodels for complex surgery and guides for where the surgeon put the screws in. So everything fits, and these are designed for individuals. So there was a post-listing review in 2023 that was implemented in February. And basically it was decided that for each procedure, there should be a limit of 3 biomodels and 3 guides per procedure, regardless of how many actual implants were being used. And this was completely limited to craniofacial. And this is very hard to express, but they must only be used in a specific device. So basically, they have to be designed to be used in a specific device that has a rebate code on the PL. So basically, a manufacturer of guides can't manufacture them for any implant. They can only be for very, very specific ones. And it's very hard to prove that. So that's quite a challenge for these manufacturers. And if one post-listing review wasn't enough, there's a stage 2 post-listing review, which has been announced a few days ago, focusing on cost effectiveness. Next. The other interesting thing is for the implantable cardiac devices. So traditionally in the private sector, the cost of the very extensive support services for these devices has always been included in the prescribed list benefit. And these same services are not typically offered in the public system. And it's always been a bone of contention because the industry always claims, you know, a lot of justification that a lot of the cost of the device is in the support services. So MSAC evaluated what proportion of the benefit can be allocated to the device and what can be allocated to the support services. And this too was contentious in that industry maintained that MSAC made unreasonable and unsupported assumptions about the salaries of technicians. The industry estimated at $85 an hour, and MSAC thought that was unreasonable and said $50 an hour, and the cost of training. So, you know, subsequently the actual, you know, what the industry believed they were spending on these services has been somewhat cut by the MSAC evaluation. So basically at the moment, 56 of the benefit is allocated to the cost of the device and is subject to the mandated price decreases. Okay. So new fees, they're not, so basically I've just popped them up there. There's not a huge change. One thing I forgot to put on that table is that the annual listing fees for the PL will go from about $200 per listing to, we believe, to about $400 or $450, but I don't believe that's been announced yet. There's actually a slight decrease in the standard fee, but the rest of them rose, you know, somewhat marginally. So if you're doing PL applications, I would try and do them early if you can. I mean, it's often hard with aligning with TGA applications and things like that. But the health products portal, which is the online application system, is really clunky, and there can be numerous glitches. And it can be, you know, if you're doing it at the last minute, you may get stuck. And the HPP support can take several days to resolve an issue. And the response to an email is very random. Sometimes they're absolutely fabulous, and sometimes it can take days. But I have to say, I've noticed over the years it's improved a lot. But sadly, the Secretariat response time has worsened, and I think my expectation at the moment is that an email to the department will not be answered, at least in the first instance. So that can be really difficult for people who have a question. The other thing, invoicing for the fees that were in the previous slide is very random. So generally the application fee, standard fee will be invoiced quite quickly, but the other fees, it's completely, it's random. I just received an invoice for 10 months after the application. And another thing that's happened, I've noticed, is that applications have been upgraded from tier 1 to tier 2 without letting the applicant know. And there's a really big difference in fees, $1,500 to about $5,000. And if you have a number of applications, that can be quite significant. Okay. Well, I'm only going to mention this the HTA review because I understand that George is all over it, according to him. But basically, it was a technical review of the HTA methodology, and there was a very, very lengthy report this year with highly technical recommendations. But it was mainly designed for pharmaceuticals, but it would definitely have implications for MSAT, because generally MSAT and PBAT, the committee members change between them frequently. So it will be important for MSAT as well. So my predictions for 2025, there must be an election by 2025. As I said, high probability of a hung parliament with a minority government of either brand. And I think looking at what's happening, there's likely to be a real crisis in private hospital access. I don't know if any of you listening would have been following this, but Bupa and Healthscope are apparently having a huge dispute, and the Australian Health Services Alliance, which is a consortium of smaller insurers, and basically they've gone out of contract with Bupa, which means in February their 6.6 million members will not be able to access any Healthscope hospital, and Healthscope is the second biggest private hospital provider in Australia. But basically, I think so watch that space. There was sort of an emergency review into the financial stability of the private health sector, and I think this could be an issue that really blows up next year. I really don't think the outcome of the election is likely to derail the ongoing reforms for the PL or overall health technology assessment branches. I do note that I always think, in my experience, the coalition government pays more attention to the insurers than the Labor government, and that the Labor government may be more open to listening to other points of view. And the private health insurers will continue to lobby for further, prescribed list decreases. And that's it for me, and I'm going to hand it over to George. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. So actually, Sarah and I are in the same room, so I've been listening intently, and looking forward to the next half of the half hour, half presentation as I lecture you or talk at you. But again, we've got the messaging or the chat open, and we'll answer questions at the end if there are any or not. So I'm just going to take a somewhat humorous view and a somewhat reflective view. And as you can see, somewhat shockingly for Sarah and I, we realise it's the 10th annual webinar we've done every November from 2015. And you can see our wonderful colour scheme on the left-hand side there from November 2015. Also my previous company, which actually still exists, Emerald Corporate Group. And now here we are 10 years later, Sarah, and we have someone else in the room whose phone kept going off. I won't dog them in who they are. Anyway, thank you to everyone who's been hanging around with us for this amount of time. I also thought, just it's a bit of a memory lane type of morning and 10th webinar. This was actually my agenda for the first webinar we did in November 2015. I think the theme of today is going to be nothing's really changed. So I'm still talking about the same stuff. So that was my agenda from 2015. So you can see top left-hand side, life-saving drugs program. There was a big review. It's still ongoing. And even in the recent HTA review that's happened, that spent a lot of time and money and paper and PDFs, it's still a bone of contention, or at least what are we going to do with it? There's at least 3 recommendations that refer to the LSDP about covering principles, eligibility, streamlining the process, and we all know how difficult it is. You've got to fail the PBAC process to get onto it. And then also what the role is to get the drugs on there. Obviously, the PBAC guidelines were a hot topic back in 2015. They were being reviewed, and we've got our version 5.0, September 2016. But even now, the HTA recommendation reviews that come out, we're looking at discount rate, comparator selection, and a bunch of other things. PBAC stakeholder meetings are still happening, not as often, I think. So that's a nice ongoing part. But then the managed access program, the top right-hand side, it's a big thing. We still don't do it very well. Experience is still not extensive. There's limited public available learnings from it, and I'll go into that a little bit later because I'm interested. But also, it's been revisited again via the HTA review, whether it's the bridging fund a recommendation, and Norgine had some very interesting discussions or interactions with the department on an early access program, which we'll get into. So you'll see today's webinar or update for 2024. There'll be a little bit of forward and backwards looking around. So hopefully I'm not boring you too much and being too sentimental, but I'm too old and I've been in this for too long. And I think I keep seeing things like the snake that swallows its tail. We keep going around and round in circles. And with that theme, I just thought I'd remind people back in 2015, the top 10 drugs by prescription count were basically cardiovascular drugs. You can see on the top left, it's atorvastatin, survastatin, esomeprazole. And lo and behold, when you look at the statistics for 2023, even though the counts have gone up significantly, lo and behold, it's all the same drugs. So the PBS, while it evolves and looks after innovative drugs, and we all complain about things, most of the drugs being used are the staples of trying to improve our cardiovascular and gastric health. But you'll see when we get to the PBAC submissions, it's oncology that dominates. So you'll see there's a recurring thing that we do things the same way. And because there's a different variety of people on the webinar and who subscribe to it, some of these may be a little basic for people who know what we're talking about. But it's good to just set the frame again, as Sarah does every year, as I do, about what do we have in Australia. And it is a good public healthcare system, which is underpinned by probably the four big public systems of MBS, PBS, the public hospital system and aged care. And as Sarah said, the wonderful relationship between the private hospitals and the private health insurers that continues to amuse me in the LinkedIn world and in the social media, even in the press. And I'm not going to go down that road, but that forms Australia's healthcare system in a nutshell. But when it comes to HTA and what else is available, it does become complex and fragmented to some degree. And I have shown this before, but and I just realised, Sarah, I've still got a plaque. But just to orientate people, obviously we need to have our products registered by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And then you sort of go down these three pathways of HTA assessment, health technology assessment, to get reimbursement or pricing. So medicines, vaccines go down the PBAC, PBS road. Medical services, allied services go through MSAC to get onto the MBS. NHRA funding, which is for high-cost therapies in the public hospital sector. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Obviously, Sarah did a great job on the prescribed list, the PL. Its full name is the prescribed list of medical device and human tissue products, which only a public service bureaucrat could come up with that acronym. We still call it the PL. I still call it the prosthesis list. But also, if you're in the space here of HTA, there's also some other programs that you can see on the right-hand side. We've spoken briefly about life-saving drugs program, our public/state national immunisation program, and then also the National Blood Authority. And those last two also put their applications through MSAC or the PBS or PBAC. So coming back to the HTA review and why it's important, the HTA ethos or methodology underpins a lot of what we do in Australia from a public and even private reimbursement. And it will continue to do so probably long after I'm giving these webinars. Again, just for the people who don't know the system too well, this is a good summary slide of the reimbursement on the pharmaceutical side. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but you submit to the PBAC, you try to get onto the PBS for subsidised therapies. We have sort of an indirect reference pricing system. That's why I've got an influencing arrow back the other way. Especially on the cost min basis, as we know, the lowest cost comparator is the big issue. And then there's some other information coming, but the PBAC almost always considers, or we are even proposing risk-share agreements to deal with specific uncertainties. And almost all new chemical entities have some form of data agreement or a contract between the Commonwealth Government and a medicine sponsor. And really, at the end of the day, if you look at the bottom, you're trying to do one of three things. You're trying to claim your product is superior to something else, non-inferior, and you're probably not trying to tell it it's inferior, but it does exist. Obviously, if you have a superiority claim, you're looking at cost utilities, analysis, cost effectiveness, and the price is essentially based on an acceptable ISA. It's not really a threshold system in Australia, but it is a key decision driver, including the clinical and economic endpoints and financial, I should add. Non-inferiority leads to cost mins, and the problem there is this definition of what the lowest cost or what the comparator should be. There is argument between the industry and the department on that definition. It is one of the key pillars of the HTA review. Essentially, it leads to indirectly reference pricing. And then there is also a price evolution in Australia of what happens to our drugs once we get onto the PBS. So you've got essentially 3 buckets of periods. The good thing is you've got an initial price setting and somewhat good price, relatively good pricing. But if you're not careful, your risk share agreements and budget caps can come back to bite you. And we all know informally of disasters. That's not really made public, unfortunately. But during the patent period of a product, there is some stability in the pricing over the years. We, as an industry, have negotiated anniversary price reductions and even some catch-up price reductions. So while it's backwards, you can also ask for price increases. It does happen, and we've been involved. And then post-patent period is moving to the F2 formulary, 25% reductions for biosimilar generics, and price disclosures had a big effect on driving down prices. So that's just a brief overview of the system, which I know a lot of people on the call will know it. But there's been some interesting seismic shifts again in the HTA world, especially when it comes to personnel in senior positions. I think the big one earlier this year was Professor Andrew Wilson and Robert Ward stepping down as respective chairs of the PBAC and the MSAC. And I would have to say, somewhat surprisingly, Professor Ward has popped up as the chair of the PBAC. And I think there's been a lot of lay press and industry press written about that. I'm generally half glass full, so I still remain optimistic. I'll wait to see. Robert hasn't really had much of a chance to have too many meetings so far. So we'll see what that era will bring. Jonathan Craig moved over from the PBAC to the chair of the MSAC. I think that's a good move, as is the Professor Fong as co-deputy chair, and Associate Professor Sarah Norris, who's well known to the industry, co-deputy chair of MSAC. I think it's all generally good appointments moving forward. I'll just digress a minute because I don't have any slides on or bullet points on the recent delays of PBAC and codependent applications. And if someone wants to be asking me a question, they can, but I don't think it's the fault of the incoming chairs or so forth. That's a bigger issue. So overall, I think it's a pretty good outcome. And Professor Wilson remains involved. He's now, we'll get to that in a minute as well, but he's on the implementation committee or the chair of the implementation committee, and I think there's a good of the HTA review. So I think there's a good continuity of his expertise, but also position and interest in this area. Sorry, I went backwards. Story of my life. Just some statistics and some numbers, because that's what we do. We, like a lot of people, we have access to our own database of outcomes and so forth. We use the Mouse database. But really, I looked, and I'll say I didn't do this. It's the royal I or the royal we. I had the team look at it. The main thing, we sort of looked at the last 3 years by submission type. And I was kind of interested, if you boil it all down to, I think it's very stark. The top left-hand corner, the category 1 submissions, which are normally cost effectiveness analysis, new chemical entities, you can see most of them are rejected, almost always. That's those green bars. Whereas as you move down to the less contentious or the ones that have been through the system, are the category 2, 3, 4s, secretariats, early resubmissions, early re-entries, standard re-entries. You can see that the skew to being recommended happens a lot easier. And I think that's the main message I wanted to put out from this particular slide. And obviously, you can delve into which products, which areas how many meetings and so forth, but that's not for this webinar. But if someone wants to learn more, yes, please call me. The other interesting thing is if you look at it by therapy area, the anti-neoplastic immunomodulating agents have been dominating forever and will continue to dominate. I'll just remind everyone some of the new innovative cutting edge areas like gene therapies and less so, but cell therapies don't represent here because they go through the MSAG process. Not all of the gene therapies, but some. But then if you exclude the immunomodulating agents and so forth, you can see, I think, again, a clear pattern. Like the top 3 or 4 is the drugs in the nervous system, alimentary canal, anti-infectives, and then a bunch of other various things, and respiratory and urinary sex hormones come in. I want to plug a little bit Amgen because they do, Ian Noble, the market access lead there, and the team, they fund and do a very good analysis of what they call the Australian patient access gap, and you can really have it available. I think there's a link in the PowerPoint presentation too. But I think the main thing here is on the left-hand side that as part of the HTA review, faster and quicker access is a key thing. And when we say that, what we're talking about is you can see on the bottom left-hand side that the days between TGA registration and PBS listing is 591 days. But there's also a bunch, and that's over. It's not quite 2 years. Thank you for my maths, Sarah. I'm not a health economist, by the way. But you can see so much more seriously that there's products, quite a few with positive recommendations and 1,000+ days that still aren't on the PBS for whatever reason. And you can see how those numbers play out, that you can see the ones that are listed on the right-hand side in the blue schema, which ones are cost effectiveness versus cost min, CEA versus CMA, and you can see a clear pattern that the cost mins go through quicker on first attempts, lower days. But then again, on the bottom in the purple boxes, there's a lot of positive recommendations that are not moving through the system. And that's that post recommendation phase, whether that's pricing, risk share agreement, or so forth. It is a stumbling block. So we've talked a lot about the HTA review. So I look back again to what I said last year, or what I was talking about. And last year we said, what are we looking forward to in 2024? And actually, I think I was lying. I wasn't looking forward to the HTA review. And in the end, it was a lot of work for a lot of people, a lot of commentary. And the idea was to try to link the HTA reform, the National Medicines Policy, and the House of Representatives inquiry, and that's still hanging around too. So that's what we said last year would happen, and to the credit of everybody involved, they did get it done in 2024. So in September, the accelerating access to best medicines for Australians now into the future was released. And the HTA review has made 50 recommendations across a range of areas, and not just methodological, but improving access and technologies, ensuring equity, and making the HTA process simpler for consumers and clinicians, and I dare say the industry. And you can see some of the previous numbers we talked about, why we're talking about that. There's a lot of slides, a lot of reports out there, but this is our attempt at summarising the 50 recommendations into 7 buckets. So I'll read them out, but people can read them themselves. So top left is providing equitable access to underrepresented patient groups, that includes First Nations, etc. Streamlining the pathways for timely access. To me, that's a big one. Policies, methods and process supporting the translation of these HTA recommendations into patient access, transparency and stakeholder involvement. How do we use real world evidence and data in this HTA process? And what methods do we have for confident decisions? And then the supporting architecture underneath, whether it's a single entry point, support, more people and so forth, KPIs, etc. I'm not going to go through the 50 recommendations. You can read the report and any number of other summaries that are out there. But the main thing that has come out of this HTA review is what are we going to do about these 50 recommendations? And the main thing is that one of the recommendations or one of the pillars of that review was how do we implement it, or what do we implement, and what timeframes do we use? And so there is an implementation advisory group, another wonderful three-letter acronym, the IAG. As I mentioned earlier, chaired by Professor Andrew Wilson, the ex-chair of the PBAC, and obviously at Sydney Uni, the Menzies Centre for Health Policy. I think it's a great appointment. And also he will be joined by another great set of people you can see on the left, including industry, consumer representatives, health economists, and departmental executives. I think it's a good mix. And Harris and Pfizer had a nice insight series last week on this, where a lot of people from the industry attended, and I think Andrew, Liz and Anne were all there discussing what's coming, and they are waiting for directions from the department or the government. And I think everyone's eagerly awaiting to see how the group takes the recommendations and puts forward an implementation plan for all 50 recommendations. But I think also, as was mentioned last week too, but also by Minister Butler, it's interesting and I think appropriate that the IAG will also consider findings of the earlier HTA report, known somewhat colloquially as the Zimmerman report, because Trent was one of the co-authors, and the other minister escapes me. Yeah, but anyway, that was the Enhancing HTA and the New Frontiers, Delivering Better Health for All Australians report from 2021. So you can see it's been sitting around for 3 years. So I think this team's got a lot cut up for it. Will anything happen in 2025? I'm not sure about implementation-wise. I think we as the industry are looking for quick wins. I'm hoping there will be some, but I think this team has got a lot of work to do, and I think it's a good team, and I'm looking forward to seeing what their outcomes will be. And I think it's exciting for 2025 onwards. I mentioned before we go around in circles around managed access, managed entry, and I've got a bunch of slides, but I thought I'd start off with discussing somewhat surprising announcement from the Minister that the department was funding an expanded access program for Norgene's product DFMO, which costs between $500,000 to $700,000 per patient. It doesn't have TGA approval yet. It's not even pursuing PBS. It's in the process, and it's about 20 patients that will be benefiting over 2 years, and the department's going to give them $20 million, I think was the number. So how did that come about? I'm not exactly sure. My understanding is it's a lot of patient involvement, patient lobbying, and Norgene, it's a one-off funding to remove the financial barriers. And while Norgene has this compassion access scheme, and then their application will be funded submitted to the TJ and into the PBS. I think it's interesting because, again, department hates setting precedents and so forth, but I think this is an interesting precedent because it means you can work outside the appropriate funding system if you like. And I just think there should be more discussion around that and maybe even some more transparency. But that leads me into evolution of managed entry and managed access programs in Australia. We've had them for a while. As I said, back in 2015, when we first presented on this, it was managed entry scheme back then, and it's sort of 2015, it merged, it morphed into the managed access program. The idea was that it should allow manufacturers and payers or the government to kind of have high value or obtaining value for money and getting things paid for prior to listing, PBS listing. I'm not going to go too far into the detail, but you're going to get the slides. But I think the main thing is, there's been a bunch of analyses. Robinson and Haytham up in Queensland have done a lot of work that's in the public domain. But I think there's most of them are financial agreements. Very few of them are outcomes based. Is the main part of this. And there is a framework. It doesn't get often used very much, but I think there's opportunities to do more, and we should be doing more on this point. And there's always an issue of how does it work? There's going to be special pricing arrangements, reshare agreements, and so forth. And I think I'll get to this slide quickly because the problem is the cons seem to be derailing the opportunity rather than the pros. So the cons are that it's resource intensive. It can be costly. What is the risk or the inability of the real world data to mimic the internal validity of the clinical trial? Are we the possibility of rebate and price decreases if it doesn't work? I think some of the blame has to be on the manufacturers or the sponsors to take on the risk of an MAP, especially if they can't predict or they don't want to stand behind their clinical trial evidence. But I think also, I said there's difficulty politically to change the system. And so, especially if it's shown not to be cost effective, and that means like delisting, or once you make something available, how do you take it off, so to speak? And I think that's led to a lot of issues. I'll leave that for you to read. But I think I was going to say that there has been some work, have been some successful programs, I think, as well. And there's a list of them all there. We haven't found one since 2019. We could be out of date there, but you can see the most things on the right-hand side is there's a pay for performance and a rebate and some type of outcome at X number of months. And I think that's probably the key thing from the slide. That is, they're probably the three things that would make an MAP or MES work in Australia. Also, last year, I mentioned that I was looking forward to, in 2024, the review of the National Hospital Funding Agreement, the NHRA, especially because it ends in June 2025, and we were looking to see what would happen. And the report was expected in December 2023, which was a month after our webinar. Again, I want to give some kudos to people who get it done. So they did release it in December 2023, a month after our webinar. Rosemary Huxtable was the primary author of the report. And again, it's important from a pharmaceutical point of view or health technology point of view, because for products, high-cost products greater than $200,000 is the definition at the moment, that are used in the hospital setting. It's NHRA funding that is funding that, and that's essentially where the CAR-Ts or the cell therapies fit in. And this NHRA is supposed to, the agreement between everybody ends in June 2025, which is 6 months away, and we haven't heard anything. From the department of what's going to happen. And it's not insignificant. You can see it's $134 billion commitment with federal and state governments over a 5-year period. But interestingly, just to dovetail back to the HTA underpinning of our system, at least 3 recommendations from Professor Huxtable's interim report talk about horizon scanning, a unified HTA process, and a unified HTA framework and methodology, data-driven consistency as it relates to the high-cost drugs, essentially CAR-Ts, but they're consistent recommendations that you'll see in the Zimmerman report, but also the HTA review. So I'm looking forward to seeing in the first half of next year some announcement on from the COAG and so what's going to happen to the NHRA from 1st of July 2025. And another common theme wrapped within the HTA world is the concept of horizon scanning. And we've had a good meeting from Medicines Australia together with the Department of Health and Industry about what does what should a good horizon scanning forum look like, process look like. It is one of the recommendations in the HTA review from memory, but we need to have essentially 3 themes came out from the horizon scanning forum. Was we've got disruptive therapeutic advances coming, both in the medicine world, but also in the medical technology world. And so we need to prepare the system now. Co-designing a process, and we need to understand how do we enable the system to know what's coming, and again, dovetailing back into common themes. You know, the horizon scanning process may have helped a little bit with how many submissions MSAC and the PBAC in particular are receiving and will receive into the future. And obviously, we need to talk about how do we take it into the future and be partnership on it so we're not blindsided. And I think there is a good commitment from Medicines Australia and the Department of Health and the patient groups and the scientific community to make this happen in a much more systematic way. And I'm looking forward to that as well. And there's much more we can't cover today. These are just some snippets of press releases from the Department of Health. But, you know, the esteemed Rosemary Huxtable is now the new chair of the National Health and Medical Research Strategy. I think it's another great initiative from government about the development of national strategy and how we're going to do it. There's a webinar on the 5th of December if everybody wants to join in. That's on the left-hand side. There's a lot of effort and work being done in genomics, both in getting tests funded on the NBS, which is still, I think, a lagging issue for us in Australia. Even newborn screening still is lagging and still don't understand why. And of course, because of my age group, I'm very interested in the new aged care bill that passed Parliament recently, and I will be a user of that sooner than I think, unfortunately. And I just wanted to say it's been 10 years of these webinars, and if I project forward, if I'm still doing it for the 20th annual webinar, that'll be the year 2033. And if you look online, there's a few interesting things that people are looking out that far ahead. So there's a digital blueprint for strengthening our health system, 2023 to 2033. And I think the digital world is something we haven't touched on today, the pharmaceutical world or the medtech world, but I think that's coming at a rapid rate, whether it's artificial intelligence, nanobots, brain implants, etc. The government, the Centre for Population, is estimating there will be over 30 million Australians living in the 2033, almost 50% female. I should be careful how I say these days, but I'm still going to stick to it. There's going to be 15 million females, and people can text me later or comment online if you like about it, but I'll stick to that. But there will be 30 million of us wherever you are. And more importantly, again, somewhat selfishly, down the bottom-hand side, you can see the plus 65 age group, of which I will be part of that. We are growing, continue to grow, and we will be outstripping the under 15s. in 2033, and we'll be 20% of the population. So we'll be consuming medical and health tech stuff at a rapid rate, and our system needs to look after that to some capacity. And I think the last slide is 2023, I'll be 67, hopefully not out, and still riding super fast, deadly motorbikes. Thank you, everybody. I think that's it for us. Until next time. So, yeah, sorry, I forgot. Any questions? We're sure you have none, we believe, but we're happy to call it a day if there's nothing being typed up on the chat. And we'll end right at 9:30. I'm going to give everybody about 2 seconds to type something, and otherwise, thank you for your time, Sarah. Been a pleasure. Thank you. And we'll share the slides on respective websites and emails. And obviously, you know who we are. If you don't, that's our contact details. Happy to have a chat, a coffee. We'll call it a day. Thank you once again. Kim, Sarah, we're off to get some Bellinis and espresso martinis. Goodbye, everybody.